Hello everybody, and welcome to the week. Today we're talking about the great changes that have occurred in education, and there have been several. In particular, I want to highlight 6 changes that have truly affected the way in which education is delivered, the way in which education is formulated, but then also presented to various stakeholders. And I say stakeholders instead of students because there's more than just students that are impacted by education. Truly, education is the future of any country. When you look at civilized countries throughout history, those that have advanced the most, the greatest, have had the most impact on their generation or century are those that have had the highest levels of education. The more years of education a society has, the better chance they can to fulfill their mandate, which is to advance or progress the nature of civilization. The great civilizations of our time have certainly done that. From Egypt to China to Persia, and of course through the more modern countries of England, France, Spain, and the United States. Japan, of recent, has made great strides in education, and China is intending to do the same things with their growing economies. So as we look over the last 100 or 200 years, and especially concentrating on the last 20 or 30, we'll see that there have been some profound changes that affect the way that education is delivered. First is the growth of the population. Back in the day, most people didn't attend school. In fact, it wasn't abnormal in the 17 and 1800s for students, children, to have just a couple weeks of school. It was really centered around just a few subjects. Farming would be one. So in other words, you train somebody to read and to write, hopefully, so that they can farm better. 90% of people in the United States were farming or made their money through farming. And of course, that changed. And that changed as the population grew. You needed to not only produce more food and foodstuffs, but you also moved into manufacturing. In the 1800s, we had a more technological aspect related to our economy. Technological aspect means that people had to be trained on how to operate machinery, how to work in groups, how to be managed and to manage others. So the second great move in education is this technology, if you want to call it, boom that happened in the 1800s, where you needed to professionalize in some way the workplace. In fact, a workplace was actually created during that period of time where people had to work together as opposed to isolation on the farm. The third was the centralization of governments. You had the growth of the population, you had the growth in services, the centralization of services, and then you had the centralization of government. As you had more people, again, population is a driver here, as you had more people, they needed more services. Not necessarily the services we think today, Medicare and Social Security, but just the basic services like dams and roads, education being one of them. But there's a thought that we needed to have an entity where everybody paid something to an entity, and then they provided services for everyone. This avoided what we call the free rider concept. And the free rider concept was where some people pay for a service and other people get to benefit from it. By everybody paying into an entity, i.e. the government, then somebody would create a road, a bridge, a school, a post office, common defense. So as you have this centralization of services coming from populations, of course, then you have the need, really the great need, for a government to be created. Once a government was created, then they started to take into account this educational arena, which used to be regional or even community-based. By the 1800s and early 1900s, there was a belief that it should be centralized. Centralized services just like law enforcement and the building of roads and dams. We also needed to have a more professional realm in which we provide education. That led us to the fourth aspect, the fourth big change in education. That is changing expectations. We as a populace expected that education would be delivered differently, mainly because we centralized the providing of education. And when you centralize the providing of it, people have input. And they wanted to see that The word we use is professionalism, but the word is that we wanted a standard curriculum. We wanted teachers who were trained. All of this was quite new. It didn't occur in the past. But as the mechanisms and technologies of the day became more advanced, at least in the 1800s and 1900s, there was an understanding that students that needed to have a higher level of learning, a higher expectation. So teachers and community members expected more of schools than ever before. This was the start of the lengthening of the school day, even the school year. And so as later years, in the early 1900s, it became a point that schools needed to have expectations of the work day and of the work year. And work, in this case, meaning the learning, needed to be more standardized. They had to have certain criteria. They had to be graded on that criteria to ensure that they learned these lessons. Takes us to the fifth aspect that have really changed education, and that's the influence of powerful stakeholders. Anytime you have a centralization, somebody needs to manage it. In this case, there was hiring of teachers for the first time and the professionalism in that rank. But then also you had principals. You had, in some ways, superintendents, regionalization of education, where one community was taught the same as another community. That hadn't happened in years prior. Now it did. Now there was an expectation, at least in the region, the state, even the country, that there be some uniformity in relation to what was taught. Anytime you have that type of approach, you're going to have various stakeholders who are going to have an influence in the way education is delivered. Even back in the times of Thomas Jefferson, Horace Mann, when they tried to make substantive changes to education, they weren't able to make those types of changes. There was impediments, stakeholders who were quite powerful. And those powerful individuals were able to forestall some of the changes that needed to be made. We see that today. In fact, in today's education, you'll see that there's school boards and states and federal governments that all want to have a hand in the way education is presented. As a result, there's these conflicting ambitions. You got in the account that the teaching profession, education profession, and industry is heavily unionized. So unions have a role in education. Teachers have a role. Superintendents have a role. Certainly the community in general has a role because schools are quite powerful. They provide quite a bit of income to a local economy. Of course, then there's the parents and the students themselves. There's a greater push today that students have a greater role in the education they receive. Some people fight that. That's something that's happening. The sixth major trend in education that we see, the trend that impacts education, maybe the greatest today, is globalization and technology. I use these words almost interchangeably. Technology has created globalization. Without technology, you certainly couldn't have the globalized world in which we live today. Upwards of 60% of our world's imports and exports determine and, in fact, command our economies. It's rare that you're going to produce a product that also doesn't have a buyer in another country or a producer in another country. Just about anything made in the United States can be made anywhere else, often for cheaper. And so what we see in our educational system is that if you can provide, if you can create a product in another country and sell it, that your economy is going to expand and your standard of living is going to be greater. So other countries realize that the two big drivers to success are infrastructure and education. And they're putting quite a bit of money in the educational system within their country. We now realize that the United States spend upwards about, they're the top fifth, maybe number 5 or 6 in terms of money spent on education. Depending on the study that you see, we rank 17th to 20th in terms of science, reading, and writing. So we spend a lot, but we don't get a lot. But we demand more of our education today. We just don't demand that they teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, commonly known as the 3 R's. We demand that they teach other aspects. Teach them certain aspects of living in a globalized world. We teach them trade craft. In some ways that takes away from learning about the reading and writing and arithmetic. what we call the basics of education, or we've moved away somewhat from that. And there's some movements to move back to that, to provide this core, this foundation that really is going to produce a well-educated child. So where does that lead us? 6 great changes that have altered the way that we present education today. First is the growth of population. Second is the centralization of services, where education is really being created and produced by sole entities. There's a centralization of governments, which really happened at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. It was from population required services that you needed to have one entity that was going to provide those services. There's changing expectations, not just providing the 3 R's, but other aspects related to education. More of the work day, in this case the school days, devoted to aspects other than teaching the 3 R's. For instance, career management is a subject in high schools today. Never has been before. Not to say it's not a good thing, but teachers have to teach other aspects besides what we call the core, the foundations or fundamentals. Fifth is the influence of powerful stakeholders, not just the unions, but teachers, superintendents, local authority, states and federal governments. And lastly, technology and globalization really has reformed the way in which our world thinks and acts. As a result of just about anything that is created today, it's going to be influenced by how well you can produce a community, a culture that is going to be amenable to globalization technology, but is going to embrace those changes, and as a result, create a different type of educational system, a different type of culture, a different type of community, a different type of country that is going to realize that the changes of today are going to be different tomorrow, and those organizations that last, those communities that last, those are going to be the ones that create a populace that can dream of something better and are determined to achieve it. That is, in reality, one of the major goals of education today. Dream of something better, dream of a world that's better, dream of an organization that products better, but then be determined to achieve it. All the while recognize that we do live in a globalized world. We live in one people that live and inhabit this world. And we have to ensure that we can create a world that is going to be not just sustainable, but is going to be given to the next generation in a much better place than it was given to this generation. We'll talk more as the week progresses, everybody. Enjoy.